Okay, so we're going to slightly shift gears now and move from kind of the pure, more simple strain theories to a different but connected set of theories that we call subcultural theories. Now again, this isn't just one theory. There are several different subcultural theories, different theories that believe that a subcultural perspective, an understanding of our society as being made up of different subcultures, can explain criminal behavior. So, strain theories think that structural conditions are what causes crime, right? That structural conditions like poverty, socioeconomic status, inequality are what causes crime. Well, in subcultural theories, the motivation for crime is in the ideas and the values that small subcultures within our society have. And if ideas and values that are present for small subcultures conflict with the dominant culture, that's going to cause crime. So, for subcultural theories, again, the motivation for committing crime is actually that because of the subculture that you're part of, the things that you value and the things that you set out as ideals are going to be different, and they're going to put you at odds with conventional society. So according to a subcultural theorist, and you'll see that each of the different theories in this area has kind of their own explanation for this, but for a subcultural theorist, when people are committing crime, they're actually primarily conforming to values and expectations of their subculture. They don't really think of themselves maybe as doing something criminal so much as they are doing something that is accepted and conforming for the group that they consider themselves a part of. So these theories assume that within our larger society, if you want to think of, our greater American society, there are some small subcultures where ideas and values have developed over time, so that there are some cultures and some subcultures that tolerate or accept or encourage criminal behavior. And if you're a part of that subculture and you're committing those acts, you really think of yourself more as conforming than you do being deviant or delinquent or criminal. So these ideas are really heavily influenced, you'll see, by the things that come up in the anomie and the strain theories. Because for each of these subcultural ideas, for the most part, people that make up these deviant criminal subcultures are people who also are experiencing lower socioeconomical conditions. And you'll see that there are social and structural elements to all of these theories. They're not just saying that ideas and values just form out of midair and subcultures just form kind of at random. What they're saying is subcultures tend to form amidst groups of people who are also experiencing all of these other structural problems in our society. So in that way, you'll see when we look at some of the specific examples, these theories are really heavily influenced by what you've already learned about in anomie and strain theory. And in this theory especially, and this group of theories, in the group of different theories that are all subcultural theories of crime, for the most part, as you will see, the people that wrote these theories were trying to explain a very specific type of criminal behavior, and that was criminal behavior that arises from lower class adolescent boys. Specifically, these theories were really born out of a time period in the United States when people were very interested in explaining and understanding youth gangs. When youth gangs kind of hit our understanding and knowledge, when we first became aware that gangs were forming in cities and committing all different kinds of crimes and problem behaviors, researchers started to take interest in this group and developing theories to explain their behavior. And almost all of these theories, they really, this is their primary group. They don't claim to be theories that can explain crime at a greater level, but they're not interested in that. They're interested in explaining why particular subcultures might be crime prone. So in these theories, you're going to see that people, researchers in the area, have very different ideas of what it means to be a subculture in our society. They kind of toss around this idea that subcultures form, but as you'll see, not all of them really agree on how separate a subculture has to be from a society, from the culture at large, to really be called a subculture. So think of it visually depicted in this way, as you'll see. So on this slide, I have a big yellow circle with the word culture on it, and I want that to represent to you the idea of our larger American culture, the culture that the majority of Americans ascribe to in this country. Subcultures, you can think of them, and researchers tend to depict them in two basic ways in these theories about crime. There are some people who say that subcultures are purely and completely different from the culture at large. People who are part of these subcultures are in pretty much no way connected to the larger American culture and don't ascribe to the values and ideals of the larger American culture. So there are some people who believe that subcultures are like this. They are truly isolated, distinct pockets of people. Then there are other people who don't necessarily agree. There are other people who believe that subcultures can still have people in them who ascribe to some of the ideals and values in the larger, more dominant culture in our society. So, for example, theorists in this area say that people who are part of this subculture might still have some of the ideals and some of the values of the greater culture, but they would still consider themselves more a member of this subsect, this subcultural unit. And I think what you'll see is that depending on which theory you're talking about, and again, we're going to go through several subcultural theories, they the different theories think about this in different ways. And you kind of have to think about it as you read through it. What does the word subculture mean to you? What do you think a subculture has to have for you to call it a subculture? What does a group have to have for it to be a subculture? Can you call a group a subculture when they're still, at least in some way, attached to normal traditional society? Is it even possible to have a truly isolated, distinct subculture within American society? So as we go through the next couple slides, just think about this slide, and we'll go back to it at the end, and think about where you would put some of these different theories of crime. So the first perspective that we'll talk about is a theory that I tend to call both a strain and a subcultural theory. And there's a couple theories that are like this. They have elements of strain theory in them very prominently, and they also have elements of, a subcultural idea. And Albert Cohen, the first person we'll talk about, really personifies this. He has a theory that incorporates elements of both ideas. And it's not really a theory so much as in 1955 he wrote a book called Delinquent Boys, where he presents his kind of ideas and perspectives about why boys form into delinquent gangs. And people have kind of called this one of the first subcultural theories of crime. So Cohen's theory is a much better fit, according to him anyway, for explaining the crime and delinquency of young boys, because he liked the ideas in the strain theories and the ideas that were coming out of Merton, but he didn't really agree that everyone commits crime because they're trying to achieve kind of normal societal goals of wealth and success. So for him, his first break from the traditional idea was saying that people can have goals that aren't monetary. And goals can also be about wanting to achieve status amongst your friends, wanting to achieve prestige and street cred. Those are goals that people can ascribe to that have nothing to do with the traditional American ideal of getting money. And those goals, according to Cohen, can also be reasons why people commit crime. So he believed, and again, he's interested in explaining lower class urban boys, and he believed that something really important happens to boys of a lower socioeconomic status when they reach their schooling years. For him, this is a very important time period in a young boy's life, because school is something that he thinks of, Albert Cohen thinks of, as kind of a middle-class institution. The people that run it tend to be people from the middle class. They've kind of designed goals and standards that, they expect people coming into school to be prepared in a certain way to enter school, equipped with certain amounts of basic knowledge and skills. So he sees school as a middle class institution? Well, according to Cohen, lower SES boys, boys of a lower socioeconomic status, start going to school and realize almost immediately that they really can't compete with this, what he called middle class measuring rod. They come to school probably having been encouraged much less to read prior to schooling years. They come to school, maybe they realize that they're the boys who are standing in the paid for lunch line while other people's parents packed a lunch for them. It's all of these little distinctions that, according to him, boys start to notice in school and realize that they're already set up for failure because of their position, their status in life. For him, this realization that they can't compete with the normal measurements and the normal goals set out for them in school, that's going to cause them to feel strain and frustration. This is going to cause them to get angry. So, according to him, the solution that most boys come up with to deal with this, low SES boys come up with to deal with this, is they form these delinquent gangs and flip middle class values. So in other words, boys start to realize in school that they can't compete. They're not going to be able to get as good grades. They're not going to be able to be successful on sports teams, be successful in school. So instead, they kind of band together and find other things to value. They flip middle class values. Instead of trying to achieve success in school, they try to achieve success on the streets. They try to get physically tough. So over time for him, the reason why delinquent gangs form is these groups of low SES boys get together and form into gangs that value things that they actually can try to achieve and be successful at. And that's how aggression and violence and criminal activity starts to become accepted and valued over time. That's something, according to Cohen, that these boys can actually strive for and be successful at. So you can see how Cohen's theory has elements of both the ideas from Strain and how his theory is kind of a subcultural theory, because it's primarily about frustration that they feel based on their status. In that way, it has elements of the ideas from Strain. Strain still comes from anger with and frustration with the normal middle class structure of our society. But for him, and this is where the subcultural idea comes in, gangs form, and it's through these gangs that new things start to get valued and accepted, and that's why delinquent youth gangs tend to form and be successful and maintain. So it's kind of a theory that has both subcultural ideas and Strain ideas in it. Now, again, this wasn't exactly a really well thought out theory. I mean, I can bring in and show you this book that Albert Cohen wrote. It's a very small book. He didn't collect data about this. He didn't actually try to necessarily prove his ideas. So the next people that took this idea and went forward with it flushed it out a little bit further and formed it into what you would consider maybe a more concrete theory. So the next type of Strain/subcultural theory that we'll talk about was written in the 1960s by two theorists named Cloward and Olin. And again, I would consider this theory, and most people would consider this theory, a theory that has both Strain and subcultural elements to it. And this is a theory that they wrote, which was called differential opportunity theory. Now, in this theory, they start out by, again, their interest here is explaining gang, low SES boy delinquency. In the 1960s, this was a big, growing, hot topic in the United States. This was before people knew or were concerned about things like terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. Back then in America, people were really interested and worried about the forming and spreading of youth gangs. So that's why all this research came about at this time. So according to Cloward and Olin, lower socioeconomic status kids realize at a pretty early age that there's a pretty big discrepancy out there between what they want, what they see as goals and as things to strive for, and what they can actually get. So lower SES kids get exposed to images of people with very successful lifestyles, fancy clothes, nice cars. They want all the things that most other people want, but they realize at an early age that they are set up because of their position in society in such a way that they really can't get the things that they want. So there's a big discrepancy that they realize early in life, big discrepancy between what they want and what they can get. You can imagine, again, you can see how this is a theory that has strain elements in it. Their social position is what's causing the problem here, because they feel angry at the injustice of this. So the strain here comes from them feeling angry that they cannot get the goals and the goals like money, clothes, merchandise because of their position. And for him, the reason why people form delinquent gangs, this is where the subcultural element comes in, is they form delinquent gangs to deal with this frustration and to figure out ways to get these goals. So think about how this is a little bit different from the ideas of Cohen. Remember in the slide just before this, Albert Cohen said, delinquent gangs form and flip middle-class values. They find new things to strive for. That's not the case for Cloward and Olin. According to them, delinquent gangs form and try to get all of those same goals. They just realize that they have to form gangs and try to get them illegally. They form gangs to try to get these goals, and it's called differential opportunity theory, because depending on the neighborhood and the opportunities available to you, that's going to influence what kind of criminal activity you can use to get what you want. So the type of gang that you form really depends on opportunities in the area. If you live in an area that has a thriving drug market and you're a young group of kids, you're probably going to form a gang that tries to get in on that market because it's going to get you money to get you what you want. If you are in a neighborhood that has a high has a mafia component to it, has a lot of different competing crime families, you might try to form up with, become soldiers in one of those families, one of those organizations. In other words, for them, the type of gang is going to depend on the opportunities in your area, but you're still forming that gang to try to get kind of conventional societal goals. So you can see how this is kind of a mixed theory. There are elements where feeling strain seems to be really important. You feel angry at the injustice of your position, so you try to commit crime. But you can also see how it's a subcultural theory, because really it's once the gang is formed that achieving these goals by criminal means becomes accepted and valued. Now what's interesting about Cloward and Olin is they actually were people who had a lot of contacts politically. And in the 1960s, John F. Kennedy and then his brother were actually family friends of the Kennedys in the 60s. I think, and I'm going to have to look this up and get back to you guys, but I think it's Olin that actually went to school with JFK. So these ideas that they came up with and they wrote about were things that actually went right into the hands of policymakers and kind of helped form some of the early political the early legislation targeting kind of lower class urban youths who are at risk to form these kind of gangs and get into trouble. We kind of started fighting, the war on poverty in this country, in part at least because of research like this being done by Cloward and Olin that happened to get into the hands of people who used it as they were forming policies. So it's an interesting example of a theory that actually got used. Now, those past two theories that we've talked about Albert Cohen's theory and we've talked about Cloward and Olin's theory. This next theory that I'll talk to you about is really a more pure subcultural theory. What I mean by that is there isn't that much of an element of strain in this theory. And this is a theory that was written by Walter Miller, and people tend to refer to it now as Miller's theory of focal concerns, which again was written right around this time period where the interest in explaining and understanding gang violence and gang crimes was very high. Late 1950s, early 1960s, this was a hot topic. It's understandable that most of the things that you're learning about this class were written around this time period. So Even though this isn't a strain theory, Miller is still interested in explaining lower class crime. He's interested in understanding what it is about the lower classes culture that causes some people to commit crime. So, this is kind of a big assumption he's making because, according to Miller, he really believed there is a general lower class culture that some members of the lower class ascribe to. And if they ascribe to it, they're going to be very likely to be people that commit a lot of crime. And according to him, lower class culture has these focal concerns. And the first letter of each of the focal concerns abbreviates into FATTES. So I always like to remember it as the fatties. So here are the different focal concerns that he talks about. The first one is the focal concern of fate, F. And what he meant by that is he really believed that in this lower class culture, they tend to believe that a lot of their future is out of their hands. They put a lot of, stock in the fact that it doesn't really matter what they do, they can't change their future. So they don't really try to be anything different or better. So fate for him is a big part of the lower class culture. The second one is the idea of autonomy. And what he meant by that is the boys who ascribe to this culture primarily are out there to watch their own backs. That boys who ascribe to this culture over time learn that what's most important in life is to look out for themselves, to get theirs. And this autonomous idea is something that he thinks is very important to this lower class subculture. The third focal concern for Miller is the focal concern of trouble. And what he meant by that is that boys who ascribe to this culture value being in trouble and in opposition with law enforcement. They see being against kind of the grain and being against the man and being against the police and the government as something to value. Being in trouble in this lower class culture is a good thing. It's a good thing to be known as a badass or a troublemaker in their neighborhood. The fourth focal concern is the focal concern toughness. And basically what he means by that is people who ascribe to this culture really value being brutal, physical, tough people, especially with regards to other kids. Setting yourself as being able to fight, beat people up, being tough is seen as a key way to get status in your neighborhood, status amongst your group. So toughness was a big focal concern for this lower class culture. And again, if you think about it, most of these things really aren't things that he really believed anyway that you could put into kind of the dominant larger culture. So the next focal concern is the idea of excitement. And what Miller meant by that is that thrill-seeking, exciting activities are a big part of daily life. So for him, kids who ascribe to this culture are always trying to find newer, riskier, more exciting things to do. Living a very exciting lifestyle was thought to be something you should value and try to achieve. Living kind of a boring lifestyle was not valued, thought to be kind of lame and, wimpy. And the final focal concern is the idea of having street smarts. And so the focal concern is smarts, but what he was talking about was smarts on the street, the opposite of book smarts. So it's more valued to have street smarts in this culture than book smarts. Knowing how to maneuver the streets is important and more important than maneuvering in a classroom. So these are Miller's focal concerns. According to him, this is a lower class culture that if you ascribe to it, and for him he really thought that, if boys ascribe to this, they're going to get into all kinds of trouble. If you're someone who doesn't think you have a lot of control over what happens to you, you're primarily out for yourself, you like getting in trouble, you like being thought of as a bully, you like risk-seeking behaviors, you don't value, book school knowledge, that's going to set you up to be a delinquent, a criminal. It's going to set you up to form into youth gangs with similar focal concerns. Now, this is, for him, an explanation for why so much crime comes out of the lower class. So he was interested in explaining, urban boys, poor boys, gang violence and crime. And for him, he explained it by saying that boys who are committed to this lower class culture are going to be the ones that are committing the crime. Now, there are some problems with this idea. I mean, not everyone really necessarily completely bought into the ideas of Miller. And one of the problems with this idea is if we measure the crime and delinquency of all kids, if you send out self-report surveys, you ask kids of all different social classes whether or not they commit crime, it doesn't seem like it's only lower class boys who are committing crime. So this idea that people commit crime because of this separate culture that's a lower class phenomenon isn't something that necessarily a lot of people agree with. But the point of his theory is, and the point really of talking to you about it, is that this is a purely subcultural theory. Because Miller really believed that there are subsets of inner city youth who ascribe to this unique culture with these different cultural values, and that is what causes them to commit crime. He's really not saying that people are committing crime to achieve more traditional goals. He's saying that no, people who ascribe to this culture have completely separated themselves from the dominant culture. And by actually conforming to this culture, by doing what they can do to get accepted and prestige in this culture, that's going to lead them into criminal activity. Things that the traditional society would think of as criminal.